Well, hello and welcome back. I'm excited to announce that after a long delay, we are finally going to get back to covering George MacDonald's Unspoken sermons. And our sermon for today is called The Word of Jesus on Prayer. And like all of his other sermons in this book, he begins it with a quote from the Bible. In this case is Luke 18:1, which says, "They ought always to pray." But since he's going to assume we know the context of this verse later on in the sermon, I'm going to go ahead and give it to you now. This verse comes from a parable that Jesus told in which a woman who was wronged seeks justice from an unjust judge. And he, being unjust, doesn't give it to her. But she keeps coming back over and over and over again, pleading for justice, and he eventually caves. And in this sermon, MacDonald is going to be contrasting this judge with God, who often seems to be ignoring our prayers and our pleas. And MacDonald is going to explore why that is. But to start the sermon off, he says that we all go through difficulties, and in his mind, the fact that we do go through difficulties is a sign that our theory of life is incomplete. But, he says, there is a reality of being in which all things are easy and plain. Oneness, that is, with the Lord of life. To pray for this is the first thing, and to the point of this prayer, every difficulty hedges and directs us. And we'll come back to that idea later. He also sets forth his reason for writing this sermon, and it's not to defend prayer, but instead it's to encourage people to pray. He says, "But if I try to set forth something of the reasonableness of all prayer, I beg my readers to remember that it is for the sake of action and not speculation. If prayer be anything at all, it is a thing to be done. I desire it to serve for help to pray, not to understand how a man might pray and yet be a reasonable soul." And at this point, I want to jump ahead in his sermon to another part where he says something similar and expounds upon it. He says, "I would meet difficulties, not answer objections." So he wants to help people who are struggling with prayer, not those who are arguing against prayer. "I would remove stumbling blocks from the path of him who would pray. I would help him to pray." But with our motives clarified, let's go back to the parable. He's going to start by talking about the parable and giving his thoughts on it, but then he'll end, like he usually does, with a series of objections and his responses to those objections. And to start, he says that the parable itself is an instance of an a fortiori argument explaining God's nature. And of course, I had to go look up what an a fortiori argument was. And apparently, it is an argument that is based upon something that has already been proven, but is a more extreme version of it. Wikipedia gives the example of somebody who was caught speeding 10 miles per hour over the speed limit and fined $50. That is essentially what has been proven because it has happened. But if someone in the future speeds 20 miles per hour over the speed limit and is caught, we can assume by the a fortiori argument that they will be charged at least $50, but probably more, due to the severity of their crime being greater. So MacDonald is saying that by looking at the unjust judge, we can learn about the nature of God, because the judge eventually gave the woman what she needed because she pled for it. How much more so would God be willing to give us what we need, since he is, of course, great and just? Another example of this a fortiori argument can be found in Matthew 7, where Jesus said something to the effect of, "If you who are evil will not give your child a stone when he asks for bread, how much more so will God give you what you desire when you ask for it?" Now, I mention this type of argument and explain it a little bit in depth because it's an argument that MacDonald uses all the time. Whenever you're reading his stuff, look for it, because he's constantly extrapolating from human love and human justice to what divine love and divine justice should look like. Anyway, going back to the parable, MacDonald says that it is comforting that Jesus notices that we struggle with prayer and decides to encourage us. MacDonald says, "It is a comfort that he recognizes difficulty in the matter, sees that we need encouragement to go on praying, that it looks as if we were not heard, that it is no wonder we should be ready to faint and leave off. Actual delay on the part of God, we know from what follows, he does not allow. The more plain it is that he recognizes how the thing must look to those whom he would have go on praying." And now he says that part of the importance of prayer is the establishment of communion between you and God. He says, "He has called them that they may call him. that there may be some such communion, such interchange as belongs to their being and the being of their Father. The gulf of indifference lay between the poor woman and the unjust judge. God and those who seek his help are closer than two hands clasped hard in love. He will avenge them speedily. And now MacDonald draws a little bit from the end of the parable. He says, having made this bold statement, why does Jesus seem to check himself with a sigh, adding, howbeit, when the Son of Man cometh, shall he find faith on the earth? And MacDonald elaborates a little bit, saying, would they be children enough towards God to know he was hearing them and working for them, though they could not hear him or see him work? To believe the ways of God so wide that even on the breadth of his track was room for their understanding to lose its way. What they saw, so small a part of what he was doing, that it could give them but little clue to his end. And this goes back to what Alexander Pope was saying in our earlier video on the essay on man, that whatever is right. And that statement makes us bristle and sounds ridiculous because there's so much wrong in the world. But what they are saying is that the world and God are so far beyond our understanding that we just cannot perceive the good that is happening in the grand scheme of things. And while that is hard to accept, it's also hard to deny that we do not understand the world and its workings. Anyway, moving on. This question of whether Jesus will find faith on the earth when he returns allows MacDonald to jump into one of his favorite topics, and that is the idea of just doing what you're told and obeying God, as opposed to spinning your tires in endless speculation. He says, he seems here to refer to his second coming, concerning the time of which he refuses information, concerning the mode of which he said it would be unexpected, but concerning the duty of which he insisted it was to be ready. We must be faithful and at our work. Do those who say, lo here or lo there are the signs of his coming, think to be too keen for him and spy his approach? When he tells them to watch lest he find them neglecting their work, they stare this way and that, and watch lest he should succeed in coming like a thief. So throughout, if instead of speculation we gave ourselves to obedience, what a difference would soon be seen in the world. Obedience is the one key of life. And now MacDonald switches gears a little bit and starts talking about why we should expect prayer to be a thing at all, and why it makes sense that we could commune with God. He says, if there be a God, and I am his creature, there may be, there should be, there must be some communication open between him and me. If anyone allow a God, but one scarce good enough to care about his creatures, I will yield him that it were foolish to pray to such a God. But the notion that, with all the good impulses in us, we are the offspring of a cold-hearted devil is so horrible in its inconsistency that I would ask that man what hideous and cold-hearted disregard to truth makes him capable of the supposition. And since it is reasonable for us to pray, he now talks about what reasons we can have that would make us pray. He says, if I find my position, my consciousness, that of one from home, nay, that of one in some sort of prison, if I find that I can neither rule the world in which I live, nor my own thoughts or desires, that I cannot quiet my passions, order my likings, determine my ends, will my growth, forget what I would, or recall what I forget, that I cannot love where I would, or hate where I would, that I am no king over myself, that I cannot supply my own needs, do not even always know which of my seeming needs are to be supplied and which to be treated as impostors. May it not well give me pause, the pause that ends in prayer. And he continues like this for a whole paragraph, explaining lovely reasons that would cause us to pray. So I encourage you to check out the LibriVox audio recording of this whole sermon, since I'm just giving you the abbreviated version of it. I'll put the link in the description below. But the gist of the paragraph can be found when he says, he that is made in the image of God must know him or be desolate. The child must have the Father. If he has determined the being, how shall any mode of that being be hidden from him? If I speak to him, if I utter words ever so low, if I but think words to him, nay, if I only think to him, surely he, my original, hears and knows and acknowledges. Then shall I not think to him? Shall I not tell him my troubles? How he, even he, has troubled me by making me? How unfit I am to be that which I am, that my being is not to me a good thing yet. Shall I not tell him that I need him to comfort me, his breath to move upon the face of the waters of the chaos he has made? Shall I not cry to him to be in me rest and strength, to quiet this uneasy motion called life, and make me live indeed? So now MacDonald is going to jump into his favorite portion, which is the imagined objections portion. He's going to actually put forward 3 different objections and respond to them. And the first objector is one who says, "Now, MacDonald, you've been making some good points about how the nature of God necessitates that he listens to our prayers. But what if God doesn't exist? Why can't we prove that prayers work? If God did exist, surely we would be able to pray and then show some appreciable outcome, right?" He says, "We know that the wind blows. Why should we not know that God answers prayer?" And to this, MacDonald responds, "What if God does not care to have you know it at second hand? What if there would be no good in that?" So you can think about maybe some empirical white paper study looking into the effectiveness of prayer and showing that indeed it is effective. Would you be any better off, any closer to God for having read that article? Probably not. Instead, MacDonald says that it is our personal relationship with God that matters. He says, "Besides, the conviction to be got that way, by empirical study or whatever, is of little value. It avails nothing to know the thing by the best of evidence. The sole assurance worth a man's having is that to be gained only from personal experience." And then he adds an interesting tidbit, saying, "That assurance in himself which he can least readily receive from another, and which is least capable of being transmuted into evidence for another." So the most meaningful thing that we can have as evidence is also the thing that we're least able to transmit, and that is our own personal experience. And now MacDonald brings this topic around to his original intent in writing the sermon, to have people pray. He says, "God may hear all prayers that ever were offered to him, and a man may believe that he does, nor be one whit the better for it. So long as God has no prayers of his to hear, he no answers to receive from God. Nothing in this quarter will ever be gained by investigation. Reader, if you are in any trouble, try whether God will not help you." And then he tacks on a response to something that might have been happening at the time, what he calls so-called scientific challenges to prove the efficacy of prayer. And I get the feeling that people were gathering into big groups to pray for things just to see if they would happen, not out of any real need, maybe. Because MacDonald says that he's almost ashamed to allude to it. He says, "A God that should fail to hear, receive, attend to one single prayer, the feeblest or worst, I cannot believe in. But a God that would grant every request of every man or every company of men would be an evil God. That is no God, but a demon. That God should hang in the thought atmosphere like a windmill, waiting till men enough should combine and send out prayer in sufficient force to turn his outspread arms is an idea too absurd. God waits to be gracious, not to be tempted. It is better to disbelieve than believe in a God unworthy." Now, we get our second objector. And this objector says that he wants to believe. He says, "There was a time when I did believe in him. I prayed to him in great and sore trouble of heart and mind, and he did not hear me. I have not prayed since. He did not give me what I asked, though the weal of my soul hung on it. I am the worse for his refusal. I would have believed in him if he had heard me." And MacDonald says, "Yeah, maybe you would have believed in him, at least until the next desire came, which he would not grant, and then you would have turned your God away. A desirable believer you would have made, a worthy brother to him who thought nothing fit to give his father less than his all. You would accept of him no decision against your desire. That ungranted, there was no God, or not a good one." And he says that there are good reasons sometimes for God not to grant your desires. He says, "To give a man what he wants because he wants it, and without farther purpose of his good, would be to let a poor, ignorant child take his fate into his own hands, the cruelty of a devil. But he knows you better than you know yourself, and would keep you from fooling yourself. You shall be satisfied if you will but let him have his way with the creature he has made. Not many years may pass before you confess, Thou art a God who hears prayer and gives a better answer. That God should, as a loving Father, listen, hear, consider, and deal with the request after the perfect tenderness of his heart is to me enough. It is little that I should go without what I pray for. If it be granted that any answer which did not come of love, and was not for the final satisfaction of him who prayed, would be unworthy of God, that it would be part of love and knowledge to watch over the wayward, ignorant child, then the trouble of seemingly unanswered prayers begins to abate, and a lovely hope and comfort takes its place in the childlike soul. And he goes on to talk about how Paul had his thorn in the flesh and begged for it to be removed, but that God said, My grace is sufficient for thee. Power is made perfect in weakness. Verily, if we have God, we can do without the answer to any prayer. And now we get our third and final objector, who says, if God is good, why do I even have to ask for anything? If he's good and powerful, he would just give it to me, right? And MacDonald's says, what if he knows prayer to be the thing we need first and most? What if the main object in God's idea of prayer be the supplying of our great, our endless need, the need of himself? What if the good of all our smaller and lower needs lies in this, that they help to drive us to God? Prayer is the beginning of that communion, and some need is the motive of that prayer. But there's another version of this objection that comes not from one who doubts God and therefore wonders why he doesn't just give him what he wants, but instead comes from someone who trusts God and therefore just trusts him to give him what he needs. He says sometimes when we're praying, we wonder, were it not better to abstain? If this thing be good, will he not give it me? Would he not be better pleased if I left it altogether to him? And he says that this comes from a lack of childlikeness and faith that makes you fear that you might ask for something that is not good and that he'd just give it to you even though it's not good. And he says that such a thought has no place with St. Paul. He says, casting all your care upon him, for he careth for you. In everything make your request known unto him. He says, in every request, heart and soul and mind ought to supply the low accompaniment, thy will be done. And that by praying in this way, knowing that God's will is what matters and not ours, we will eventually learn to hone our desires. He says, anything large enough for a wish to light upon is large enough to hang a prayer upon. The thought of him to whom that prayer goes will purify and correct the desire. To say, Father, I should like this or that, would be enough at once, if the wish were bad, to make us know it and turn from it. Such prayer about things must of necessity help to bring the mind into true and simple relation with him. Surely it is better and more trusting to tell him all without fear or anxiety. Was it not thus the Lord carried himself towards his Father when he said, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me? But there was something that he cared for more than his own fear, his Father's will. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. There is no apprehension that God might be displeased with him for saying what he would like, and not leaving it all to his Father. Neither did he regard his Father's plans as necessarily so fixed that they could not be altered to his prayer. The true Son faith is that which comes with boldness, fearless of the Father doing anything but what is right fatherly, patient, and full of loving kindness. As to any notion of prevailing by entreaty over an unwilling God, that is heathenish, and belongs to such as think him a hard master, or one like the unjust judge. Let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. We shall be refused our prayer if that be better, but what is good our Father will give us with divine goodwill. The Lord spoke his parable to the end that they ought always to pray, and not to faint. And that ending there, and not to faint, is the verse that begins our next sermon. So I look forward to seeing you there. I'm going to finish loading up this truck. See ya.